Welcome back to our last Bible study on Amazing Grace. I'm really excited to take you through this. And as we look at where we've come, and remember this is a journey, if you're just joining us or just wanted to pipe in for the last verse of Amazing Grace, let me give you a quick 15-second, someone time me, a 15-second rundown. Amazing Grace isn't built on a 1, 2, and 4 stanza kind of song, even though churches do it all the time. Amazing Grace is built on the journey of Christianity from the beginning and to the end. So today, as we live into this last verse, I want you to think about the end. Now, as we come to verse 6, and remember, we've done some big work here. Verse 5 is, let me read it for you. Yea, when this flesh and heart shall fail, and mortal life shall cease, I shall possess within the veil a life of joy and peace. Really, verse 5 is the last verse of Amazing Grace, for all intents and purposes. I mean, we've given the summary. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. I was blind, but now I see. Okay, we got the summary verse at the beginning. And then we move into some of the beginnings of it. And as grace taught my heart to fear, and then the Lord has promised good to me. We've got that big middle piece about that struggle that you and I go through as we live through life. All of this really leads into verse 5. Because I lived a life of faith. I was taught a life of grace. I found what God promised to me. And now my mortal life has ceased, and my heart shall fail, and I shall possess within the veil a life of joy and peace. Check. Verse 5 is finished. The song is over. No, it's not. We're going to move on to one verse that's going to be our whole focus tonight. And that one verse that's so important for you and for me is that it's not over. It's not all tied up in A to Z. This is the letter after Z in our faith. And we like things to be ordered. That's how we were made. We were made in the Garden of Eden to have a beginning of the day and an end of the day. About a moment at tea time when God comes and walks with us in the garden. We've got some moments where we name the animals and we're creating and things are good, and it just keeps going in an ordered daily fashion. In fact, when we got kicked out of the garden, that's when death started to creep in and hard work started to creep in. And it wasn't just good things, but now it's hard things. And then we lived into the promise of Abraham. And then we lived into Abraham's children of Jacob and Isaac. And then we lived in Isaac and the Jacob. Let's make sure we get it in the right order. Then we live into the King David that comes, and then the fall of Jerusalem. All right, okay. One starts and one ends. You heard all of that. I mean, we could do the whole Bible, and we could spend the next hour talking about it. But pick a story in the Bible, and it begins and it ends until you get to Jesus. And Jesus isn't an A to Z kind of story, is it? And if Jesus is the bringer of grace, then that means that, well, let's say that Jesus is the fulfillment of grace and the great inviter to us to participate in this brand new way, then that means grace isn't an A to Z thing either, is it? So the very namesake of this song is not about your birth and your death. And if you're a Christian in your life that really that's what it's been about, that's okay. I'm not going to chastise you for that. In fact, I think that most Christians probably end up living like that most of the time. I'm going to go to church. I'm going to read my Bible. I'm going to pray. I'm going to do the things throughout the day that God taught me. Absolutely. This is the ordered world that God made. We didn't create this. God made this ordered world. And then someday I'm going to get old. And then someday I'm going to start thinking about where life is going to take me. And at the end, and you've heard people say this before, I'm going to receive the reward of my faith. That's not grace. Grace is not transactional, right? It's not something that we earn. If it was something that we earned, ladies and gentlemen, then your preacher is in trouble. We're all good Christians in trouble if grace is something that we earn. But that's not the definition of grace. And that's certainly not the definition of amazing grace. Amazing grace is this gift that God gave to us that we don't start our day and say, okay, I've got a checklist and I'm going to check off the list. And at the end of the day, I'm going to receive the benefits of checking that list off and getting all of those things done, of it being a productive day. The love of God is given to you whether you had a good, productive day or not. The grace of God is given to you, bestowed upon you, whether you really earned it or you didn't, whether you deserved it or you didn't. Grace comes anyway. It's why we call it amazing. It's why we sing about it being amazing. And if this was a story about, yes, I was lost and then I was found, if this was a story that I was taught and then I learned, if this was a story about that I was born and then I died, grace is all in those things. We can sing the first 5 verses and you can walk chronologically from the summary until mortal life ceasing through the verses 1 through 5, and you can receive that grace. But can I tell you something amazing? There's a verse 6. And it goes like this. When we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we've no less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun. I recently had a great conversation with some of the saints of our church. Pat Smith and Blanche Brick and Jane McDermott were all sitting outside, and we were at a graveside recently. And there at the graveside, we were talking about all of the different stones of the Aggies and the people that we've known throughout the years, the people, some of them that I buried, some of them that they've seen buried and that they've known. And we talked about the importance of that gravestone, about writing that name, and of course that all-important dash in between the numbers, and all of the sermons I could preach on those things. And it's history. It's a real live history that someday your ancestors and my ancestors are going to go back and see it. And then I asked Blanche, I said, as the historian in the group, how long do you think people do remember our names? How long do you think that connection lasts? She said, probably a generation, maybe 2. Pat chimed in and said, don't worry, if their name is on a building somewhere, it might be even longer. Sure. But you know, that might last for a couple, 300, maybe 400 years. Our university right across the street was built in 1876, and we remember some of the early folks in that university. But I want you to hear about this number that we're preaching about, singing about in Amazing Grace, verse 6. When we've been there 10,000 years. Friends, I don't know if most of the famous Aggies, or most even some of the famous presidents of our country, names will be remembered in 10,000 years. I can give you a couple of great Caesars. I can give you, and you know, I've done my history lesson. I probably know a little bit more about Rome than the average person does. I can give you a list of Caesars. I can tell you what they built, and I can tell you a couple of the infamous ones, like Nero, like Augustus, like Julius Caesar, right? I can tell you some of the big folks that were a couple, maybe 1,000 years ago, so depending on when the date was, a couple thousand years ago for some of them, right? But after 10,000 years, will we really know these folks? 10,000 years is a long time. Where your deeds and my deeds for sure, because I never have a hope of becoming a Caesar, never in my mind. Is that something I want? I don't even have it in my DNA or in my pedigree to become a United States president in the next few years. I don't plan for that to happen. I don't plan for my name to be so big that it lasts beyond a generation. And yet, after 10,000 years, there's a question that none of our names last that long. Why do we get so into this? It's kind of depressing. It's kind of like one of those moments you're like, does this really matter? What I'm doing really matters? Well, verse 6 says it does. When we've been in heaven verse 6 says. This is how amazing grace is. This incredible gift that we didn't earn or we don't deserve. But God says, if you love me, if you walk with me, if you're found by me and you respond, when you've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we've no less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun. It may be the most beautiful and thought-provoking poetry that we read in the hymnal, because it's a shot trying for us to wrap our brains around eternity. I can't really do it if you really think about it. I can't really fathom, because eternity, friends, is not just something that never ends. We can get that part of it. Eternity for us is something that was never created. That's the God that we live and God that we love every single day. That God that lives in our lives and in our hearts was never created. So God's eternity, the grace that we're being invited into, it's so much bigger than verse 1, and it's so much bigger than verse 5. This grace that we're being invited into, friends, it's for eternity. And every single day, we sing God's praise until we realize in this eternity that in this joyful praising of God, there are no less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun. Another 10,000 years, another 100,000 years, far after the earth is gone, we're still singing the praises of God. This verse lifts up this hymn for me in a new way. We talk about that in cooking, right? That you can put the standard things into a cooking pot. You can put a chicken. When I first made chicken in my apartment in Rockwall, Texas, as a married man, Kristen and I brought out our Teflon pan, and we put it on the stove, and we turned on the stove, and we placed a raw piece of chicken into the pan, and we cooked it until it was white in the middle. We added no fat to the pan. We did not salt it. We did not pepper it. We added no extra seasoning. We put it on the plate. We thought, this is how you cook chicken. We didn't have the beautiful benefit of growing up in a family restaurant or growing up in life where people are around us. I mean, our parents did it for us. And maybe it's our fault. We never paid attention to the good cooks that are in our family. And we cut into it, and it was stringy, and it looked terrible, like a white piece of paper. And I divided it in half, and we took a bite. And Kristen looked at me at my first attempt to cook chicken, and she said, "This is awful." The funny thing is, today, after we've learned something, after we've done it, we know how to lift the dish a bit. You put some fat in the pan. You put some salt on it. You put a little pepper on it. Heck, you go and get a little bit of oregano or a little bit of thyme or maybe even a little bit of allspice. I mean, do something. Throw it on there. And as you put it in there, maybe put a little bit of jalapeno sauce on it. Or maybe, well, you get the idea. In cooking, they talk about lifting the flavor up a bit so it's interesting and exciting and special. Verse 6 is interesting, and it's exciting, and it's special. And when we digest it together, we are in awe and in wonder about how much bigger this God is that gave us this invitation of what grace is. I think emotionally for me, though, even more than the fact that theologically this verse lifts up this whole hymn, I remember being at the reception at my grandmother's house for when my grandfather died. He died suddenly. So United Methodist pastor, district superintendent, he was at First Waco and First Temple. He was the spiritual hero of the family, did incredible things with his life. He died early at 76, and I was in the 6th grade at the time. And we all went over, and people were coming by from all over the state of Texas, coming to see my grandmother and to see us and tell us how much they loved Bill Greenwald. And someone said, what was his favorite hymn? My grandmother smiled and she said, well, Bill had lots of favorite hymns. I could tell you what his favorite verse was, though, out of all things. It was what the last verse of Amazing Grace meant to him when he sang that with his congregation in the funerals that he went to. And she recited it by memory, which blew my mind. I didn't know that people had it. Just these, especially these obscure verses at the end. I thought we just all knew the first verse, and then we had to read the rest of it in the hymnal. When we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, there's no less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun. A couple days later, we went to the funeral. I'd never experienced grief before. And this was my first time to really lose someone that was iconic and a part of my life, period. And I did fine during the funeral. It was sad. People told great stories. We laughed. I was moved. That first funeral I ever went to helps dictate how I want every funeral that I ever perform from now until I die to go, because it had all the emotions in it. And then at the end, when we got to this ending verse of Amazing Grace, it all hit me. And the emotions washed over me. And I took a little break at the end of the service away from the family. I was so upset. Because these weren't just words about what we believed about Jesus. For me, for the first time, I realized these words were what my grandfather was experiencing now. Not just a stanza that he sung. Not just a stanza that we sung to make ourselves feel better at the end of a funeral. It was real. It was real. And that amazing promise of God that you and I were lost, and now you and I are found for what? Becomes a real thing for us to date, now, in this place. That this is something that we're living. A promise that our life is not wrapped up in receiving grace from verse 1 to verse 5. That this is not a journey for you to know God and for you just to go to heaven. This is a journey for you to experience heaven for eternity, and you're given it, and you don't deserve it, and you have not earned it, and yet the love of God is so deep for you in your heart, and you've experienced it, and you've celebrated it, and you've received it, and you've been found, and now you live with something mysterious. Not just words, not just good music, but a promise, a hope, an experience of the amazing grace that we have for all time. How do we understand this biblically? I think it's really important to understand that the Jewish people really, in Jesus' day, didn't have an understanding of heaven. It really wasn't a thing for them. Eternity for them, for the Jews at that time, was all wrapped up in your children. The children that you have, this is why the barren were such a huge story within the Bible. Because hope wasn't really about what you individually received down the road, like it is for us as we understand what Jesus taught today. Hope for them is that you would have a child, and your child would remember your name. And in the memory of your name, you would live, because your memory was who you were and how people remembered who you were. Therefore, you must have a family that then passed down the memories and the experiences. And that line was your eternity. Now you understand a little bit about firstborn children in Egypt and firstborn children with Jacob and Esau, and it's all about passing down, not just what the child receives and for them to be set up for life. It's passing down of your memory that is entrusted to your name and to you. It gets pretty complicated. However, those three pesky wise men, do you remember that story way back in Epiphany? They were what we believe to be Zoroastrians, and even if they were the kings of old from the different continents, no problem. Zoroastrians had an influence in their life. And those Zoroastrians believed this, that there was something beyond that God had a hand in that we got to experience too. I don't know if it was their teaching specifically that influenced Jesus, but it most certainly was their people's teaching that influenced who Jesus is and was for us. And there in that moment, Jesus starts to begin to believe and to teach about what's beyond. About, in my Father's house in the book of John, there are many rooms. I'm going to prepare a place for you. Don't you know I'm going to come back and get you and take you to be where I am? It's ad-libbed a little bit, but there's the gist. Or in Revelation 21, also a revelation of John, who he takes Jesus' derivative of this promise of heaven and moves it into what we really believe to be a revelatory promise for us today. And that is that beautiful statement that we're not going to heaven to live there forever and leave birth behind. We temporarily go to heaven, and somewhere in the tens of thousands of years ahead, heaven will come down and meld itself with where Jerusalem is today. And there God will be the center and the light. And God's light will spread out to all things. It's Revelation chapter 21. I invite you to go and read it. But in all of that beautiful invitation, God says, are you ready for this? This is the most amazing part of grace. And maybe as we take verse 6 and work our way back to verse 1, amazing grace, how sweet the sound. The sound of this promise in verse 6, that we're going to be with God for tens and thousands of years and beyond. It saved a wretch like me. You know what it doesn't say? Us. It says me. I once was lost, but now I am found. I was blind. Now I see. The beauty of this poem is John Newton's understanding that this huge, massive concept of eternity, that we, no matter how smart you are, no matter how many PhDs you've earned, we cannot fathom what eternity is. And yet God takes all of verse 6, this is what's so amazing about this, and brings it all the way back to verse 1. And he says, this is how I love, not y'all, as we'd say in Texas. This is how I love you. On our television set, we've got an Apple TV box, and it saves the pictures I take on my phone, and every once in a while it pops up a little slideshow for us. It's a magical thing that happens with technology. And just recently it popped up highlights of 2020. Now, you and I could look back and say, what a terrible year. It's not what my Apple TV told me when Chris and I sat down and watched it. We watched a snapshot of birthdays, and we watched a snapshot of life, of us doing a couple weddings outside and the kids running around in the backyard together, of us eating ice cream together, of which, remember that the stores were sold out of ice cream for a while, of us putting our arms around each other and playing soccer or cornhole in the backyard, of us laughing and smiling and enjoying each other in life. And it was not a lot of extra people around. It was really just my immediate family, and yet I saw a blessing in my life that I would have missed or forgotten about or overlooked because of the hardships of what we lived through. Friends, that's what this song should do for us, like that Apple TV slideshow. To boil down our life to these amazing moments that we get to see God together in Bible studies and prayers, in the joy of the people that God puts around us, in the vibrancy of the church that we're a part of right here on University Drive. of the people that are joining, and the children that are smiling, and the children that are reading scripture passages for us on Sunday morning, and the prayers of people in the midst of darkness, sharing their prayers of hope with us as we watch them pray for us during church, for the Bible studies that are meeting virtually, for the life that God is still in your life. Corporately, 2020 was a mess, a nightmare scenario. Individually, for every single person in this world, God wants us to see a slideshow right here, verse 1 through 6. That no matter how bad it is, no matter through the many dangers, toils, and snares that you pass through, no matter how grace has brought you through darkness, on the other side is always hope. On the other side is always love. On the other side, there's always this light that shines in the darkness. I wonder if we get to sing this song and let it be a snapshot to our life, that no matter what years we've lived through, no matter what hardships that we've endured, no matter what you and I have faced, that in it is this promise. Maybe one of the most moving, defining moments of my life. And I just heard some young folks, incredible people in our church, detail out their call, what God has called them to do. I have one of those stories too. I have lots of those call stories, actually, if you really want to get down to it. One for every year I've lived, it seems like. But there in that dark, dark moment of the very first person that I lost at my grandfather's funeral, there in the hard times, the hardest moment I'd ever lived to that point, I found a depth of the joy of what grace is. I got a touch of the wonder of what eternity is going to be for us. And I couldn't as a sixth grader, couldn't wrap my head around all of what Amazing Grace is. At 40 years old, I can't wrap my head around all of what Amazing Grace is. I don't care where you are in your life or how many books you've read or how much of the Bible that you've ingested. It doesn't matter. We can't completely get this. That's what makes this grace amazing. And yet, today, we can say together, I once was lost. Now I am found. I once was blind, but I see a whole lot better. Because the love of God is given to me. Most importantly, the grace of God has been given to me. And in this beautiful order of these verses 1 through 5, we find that in our everyday ordered life, you can find it. Toil, snares, and all. And then we get to sing verse 6. And we get to say, even in the things that I cannot fathom, even in things I don't understand, even the things that I'll never be able to wrap my head around about the why of this life and the why and the how of the next, grace is given to me there too. I hope you've enjoyed this journey. I hope you've enjoyed it as we sung the song together. I hope it's been bouncing around in your head as you've been humming it, as you've been walking to your office, if you've been doing work around the house and vacuuming, whether you've been yelling at the kids. I hope you've had Amazing Grace in the back of your head this whole time, because it is a beautiful gift that you and I get to experience every day in our ordered life and the life that we don't understand. This is the gift that we get to sing about, hold on to deeply in our hearts, that the grace of God is given to you and to me, and we can find it right now and right here. We can even sing about it. I hope you have a great week. I look forward to this Lenten season as we kick it off. Lindsay's going to do a great Bible study on all of the pieces of Lent and what Lent means to us. This has really prepped us, this good stuff, for the challenging pieces of what it means to be a Christian, so that we push ourselves a bit in Lent, so that when Easter comes, we're like, oh yeah, God, this isn't just you dying and being resurrected on a cross. This is you doing this for me and helping me find resurrection as well. I hope that in the week to come, I hope that you're praying. I hope that you're so excited about it. This next Wednesday, a week from today, we're going to celebrate Ash Wednesday. It's going to be a little different than normal because of COVID, but we're going to take a moment and hold hope in our hand. We're going to take some of this ritual and make it physical and find a way to do this. We're working out the details on that, but I hope you stay tuned and that you can help come. Maybe you can come and participate as we're safe in the sanctuary with masks on, or maybe you watch it online at home and you participate with your family. Whatever it is, I hope that you begin this Lenten season and that you walk with us in this service as we kick off this 40-day journey to Easter. Have a great week. We'll talk to you soon.